Order. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second session on the Select Committee's investigation into defence in the grey zone, and we're turning for this session to a discussion of the NATO perspective. It's a great pleasure to be joined by James Appathurai. Very good to see you, sir. Would you mind introducing yourself and your role, and then we'll fire into questions.
Thank you. My name's James. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Innovation, Hybrid and Cyber. Hybrid is a bit our word for grey zone. So the below threshold ongoing activities which we're going to be discussing now. My division is also responsible for protection of critical undersea infrastructure, energy security, security implications of climate change. And I know I sound American, but I'm Canadian, so that's the general introduction.
Thank you very much for joining us. And by the sound of it, your division has got its hands full. There's many areas to cover. And I think I'm right in saying, because I think you mentioned it, that you changed the even name for the division from emerging security challenges through to specifically mention hybrid. I assume that reflects a growing concern regarding the nature of the hybrid threat. And I just wonder if you'd talk us through how that has changed and how it sort of manifests itself to NATO member states.
So you're absolutely right. We did change the name, and basically, we'd come to the realization that these were not emerging security challenges, they had emerged. And so it was important not to see these as some sort of potential future problem, but actually that we are in a constantly contested security space, and it's contested really across the spectrum. And I think what's really important to note now, and what you, I think, are correctly focusing on, and that's why I really welcome the discussion and the focus you've put to this, is that we believe the hybrid threat is not only substantial, but it is more sustained and growing on a regular basis. And frankly, I worry a little bit that we're not tracking the trends well enough. I'm a little bit concerned about the boiling frog problem, and that is that we're looking at the levels and they're growing and growing, and we're getting used to what we would have never been used to before. So what do we see? We see increasing political interference, disinformation, cyber attacks, not just threats to, but attacks on critical infrastructure. That includes cyber attacks. It includes ransomware, which is used as cover for implantation of malware into industrial control systems. We see attacks on energy infrastructure more broadly, and energy used as a weapon. The Russians have obviously been doing this as a form of coercion. But now you see new elements such as forced migration. We've seen that over the last couple of years. And now clear warnings from our military and intelligence chiefs in public about increasing risks of and acts of sabotage on our own territory, assassinations on our own territory. And the UK, of course, has been subject to both of those. And these come principally from Russia and China. We see different kinds of hybrid or gray zone pressure being put on by these two separate actors, but in some cases they are related and mutually reinforcing. And that is in particular the case when it comes to disinformation, where China is amplifying Russian disinformation on NATO, on Ukraine, on the West, including in areas of strategic importance to us. And then the final point I would mention just now as we start the discussion is there is a real risk that generative AI will profoundly turbocharge, in particular, disinformation, political interference, and cyber attacks. And we can discuss this in more detail if you wish. We've just agreed strategies on generative AI and what to do about it. but I think that this is a truly important subject as we go into US elections, UK elections, and as you all know, half the world is having elections this year. And I've just talking to the deputy prime minister of a partner country who said that in his country, the Russians are already using deepfakes to sway the population in the run-up to votes and referenda. So in a moment when, as you can see from public reporting, a lot of the platforms, social media platforms, are actually removing content moderation, and these tools are proliferating, I think that's of fundamental importance when it comes to gray zone risks.
We'll definitely want to pick up on the generative AI point you've just made. Before doing so, you refer to both China and Russia, and China echoing and reinforcing the disinformation being put out by Russia. Is the signs that that's planned and coordinated, or do you think that it's more China just seizing the option and making use of it? So is a coordination, would you say, between the two? And the second question is, are there areas where it manifests very differently between the two, between what Russia is doing and how China acts?
So I think these are great questions. And I think it's really important with regard to China and Russia to recognize that the old theories that China-Russia cooperation was in some way or another, and maybe it was at the time, ad hoc or reluctant, suspicious, and limited, is no longer the case. And this isn't just my speculation. China has a hierarchy, public hierarchy, of partnership arrangements with other countries. It has only one partner that has the highest level of signed, agreed partnership agreement, and that is with Russia. And it has a political element as a very strong military element. It continues to be deepened. So on the political, practical, military level, also the economic level, as you can see, Russia's trade with China has gone up very substantially. China is supplying all kinds of components and other pieces of equipment which Russia is using in its military campaign or war on Ukraine. And I think, now I'm speaking for myself, this is not NATO policy, but what unites them most fundamentally is a shared desire to see the United States get out of their neighborhood so they can do what they want to their neighbors. And this is a very powerful motivation. And so it is clearly the case that China is on a persistent, consistent basis amplifying Russian messages. And it is not simply an echo. I think it's really important to recognize that until just a few years ago, China would have never commented on NATO at all, or on Ukraine at all. It considered it unwelcome to have NATO or the United States active in terms of politics or messaging in its neighborhood, but it was careful about not intervening or interfering in politics or security in Europe. That is no longer the case. And it doesn't serve China's interest directly to comment on NATO. We have posed no threat to China. So you can see that this relationship is structural, including when it comes to disinformation and when it comes to activities in other political bodies, including the UN and the UN system. So how it's coordinated, I don't know, but the level of coordination and coherence is strong and persistent. But are they different? So yeah, they are different. And actually, until a few years ago, the NATO approach to tackling gray zone challenges was basically to create actor agnostic resilience. And that was to harden our systems. And by systems, I mean, everything from the political system, the information system, the infrastructure on which we rely, including cyber, so that it could resist gray zone attacks from all directions. But actually, if you look at what they do, you also need an actor-specific approach. And we have taken an actor-specific approach, different with regard to Russia, because Russia is definitely considered a threat to NATO, and acts in a much more threatening way. I mean, we have to be very clear about that. So I mentioned many of the elements. But with regard to Russia, of course, they target different communities when it comes to disinformation. They target them with different messages. We have, of course, minority communities in many of our countries that are susceptible to these messages. We have far-right communities, far-right political parties that are susceptible to these messages and to coercion. Energy coercion, obviously Russia can use it. China is not using it, and we don't depend on China for energy. Then again, forced migration, only Russia can do this against us. When it comes to threats to critical undersea infrastructure, for example, we all depend, I know the UK does, we all depend on a very long and complex network of cables and pipelines. Thousands and thousands of kilometers. Russia doesn't have this vulnerability, we do. Russia has something called the Russian Undersea Research Program, the RURP, a terrible acronym. This is a very well-funded, highly sophisticated, decades-long program. You can Google it, there's nothing secret about it, whose purpose is to, or the purpose of which is to map out all of our critical infrastructure, which they've been doing for decades, with the opportunity to damage or destroy it. China may have or may not have been in one way or another involved in the Baltic Connector damage, but certainly the effort and the intent are very different. Then all the sabotage that's going on around Europe, you've heard concerns about it. The use of organized crime networks in our country. This is very much a Russian tactic. And yeah, attacks on our logistics. Then there's all the jamming taking place in our border. Again, this is all Russia. If you look at China, it's very different. First of all, we don't consider that China is a military threat to NATO, nor is NATO a military threat to China. But there are different risks with regard to China. They include very much online activity. YouTube just recently announced that it had taken down the biggest online influence operation in history, which was of Chinese origin. Then there is political interference. You only need to look at my country, where this is a very, very live topic. One of my close friends was the direct subject of this. Michael Chong, as parliamentarians, you might know him. He and his family were put under some kind of pressure. Then there is all the cyber espionage that takes place based on very, very sophisticated Chinese capability. They use different economic levers. For example, cutting off access to the rare earths and critical minerals on which we depend or can depend. And this has happened with a couple of them just recently, or using other economic tools. For example, if you're Norway and the Nobel Foundation meets with the Dalai Lama, then you don't get to sell salmon, which is a big export for Norway for many years. Lithuania, by allowing Taiwan to open an office, faced Chinese economic coercion. And then we see the pressure on pro-democracy activists at a very, very high level. So different tactics, different audiences, different tools, different levels of capability. And we're quite convinced that on the one hand, you have to be better able to resist everything, but also you need to have an actor-specific approach to be able to effectively defend in the gray zone.
And you mentioned specifically your concerns that interference in elections could worsen with the use of generative AI. What do you think we need to be wary of? What do our peoples need to be aware of in terms of what they could be seeing in forthcoming elections around the West?
Yeah, this is a really, really important question. So I don't want to scare people, and usually my wife tells me not to talk about generative AI at dinner parties because then everyone reaches for the Prozac and goes home by the time I'm done. But I think when it comes to the disinformation space, the thing to understand about these tools is it is, as you know, on the one hand, extremely difficult to detect when AI has generated a deepfake. We have had all the major companies at very high level and sitting next to each other. So I'll tell you three things. One is they all seem to agree that their tools for detecting deepfakes are basically not very effective. The line they used with us was, there will be no deepfake detector in the sky. When it comes to video, which is probably the hardest now to generate, some of the big platforms are at something like 20 to 25% success rate in detecting a deepfake. When it comes to text, it's 0. So just to give you an idea. Second point, many communities are not inured against this. They're not yet aware of the risks, and the tools are proliferating very quickly. So for example, the UK, the US, or Canada, the English language, people are a little bit more used to the idea that there can be a very effective fake. In a lot of countries, they have never seen super effective AI-generated deepfakes, and their populations, their media, is not aware of this risk, or not enough, especially on the platform. So they are extremely vulnerable, and we're already seeing that. For example, the Moldovan political system now, they're feeling very much at risk, but it's the case elsewhere. The third point is that these tools are democratized. ChatGPT is, to my mind, a little bit the way Windows was when Windows came out. Before Windows, you couldn't program unless you knew how to program, basically. When Windows came, anybody could use the internet. Anybody could find what they wanted to. So basically, we went from a very small group of people who could operate effectively on the internet to everybody. The same thing has happened with these platforms like ChatGPT. Before them, basically, only a very sophisticated and small number of very capable people could use generative AI. Now everybody can use generative AI. So it is a democratized threat, and the number of people who can create deepfakes has become basically infinite. And so that is also a risk for us. In terms of timing, I think one of the risks that we look at is that deepfakes will be used just at key moments, in the run-up to key votes, in the run-up to referenda, just to create confusion or a different point of view, swing a close vote right at the last minute. And we already see some of that. I believe that in 2 or 3 years, people will be more used to it. But right now, I think there's a high vulnerability, again, as I mentioned, because a lot of platforms are not able to or not willing to a sufficient level, police these. Just to give you 1 or 2 more data points, what we hear from the companies is that within 1 year, 80% of what's generated for the internet in 1 year will be generated by AI. So that's an interesting data point. Worse, they all agreed when they came here last year that within 5 years of then, so 4 years from now, 90% of what's on the internet will be fake, will be false, because you can generate anything. So if you think through that, what that means for politicians, and for the political process, what I believe is most people will learn not to believe anything they see, including when they see you saying something on TV. So I think you better get used to shaking hands and going to town hall meetings, because in-person contact is going to be even more important, much more important for the political process than it has been until now because of generative AI. This is my view. We
all do a lot of that, but
you do it,
and even more. But 90% fake is an extraordinary statistic. One last question from me, then I'm going to turn to John. We're just scoping how bad the situation is, and we'll go on to what we're going to do about it. Just one last question. You referred to Chinese components going into Russia, which we know about. I'm almost more worried about Chinese components coming into NATO countries and what could be coming in with them. And so with the Internet of Things, with all the ability to smuggle stuff into components, are we right to be concerned about that? And there's a procurement regulations going through today, I think, in the House of Commons. Is it something that we are focusing enough on?
I think there are certainly allies that believe we need to be more concerned. And my personal view is we are now waking up to a correct level of concern. So it's great to hear that there are steps being taken. I mean, I saw, and I can't testify to this, but I saw in the media that 80% of the cranes used in the United States can use Chinese components and can be remotely operated. 80. So if that's even close to correct, that's only the US. So I wonder what the case is everywhere else. And so coming back to sort of more concrete measures, I think the questions related to Huawei and 5G and the components are very important. I think it's also important to recognize when we look outside of our own borders, what is happening in the rest of the world, because Chinese components are and Chinese technology is highly effective and more affordable, and as a result, countries with fewer resources that don't have options to pay more do come to rely on Chinese technology and Chinese infrastructure at all levels and in all areas. And that's something we also need to think about, because with dependence on any country for its technology comes political affiliation. And so we can talk about Africa and Asia and Latin America later if you wish. But we definitely do believe that we need to look at more carefully at the resilience of our infrastructure at all levels: cyber infrastructure, critical energy infrastructure, port facilities. We do that. And the European Union does that, of course, for its members. And we are certainly concerned of potential levels of vulnerability.
Thank you, James. Can I pass on to John?
Thank you very much, Chairman. I must apologise, I'm going to have to go after this question because I've got to go and speak in that debate. But look, you've described the changes that are taking place in the nature of the threat. What I want to just ask you about is the response, because a lot of what we see, including in your response, is to identify problems and react. And do you see any role, therefore, for NATO or indeed from allied countries in actually taking the issues to our opponents, not just being on our back foot and playing defence, but actually taking offence, particularly in stressing the claims of democracy, the advantages of democracy, but also at the same time pointing out the very deep structural and social divisions inside the autocracies, both in terms of them, but also in the battle for the neutral countries, notably in the global south.
Yeah, you ask, obviously, in many ways, the most important question, which is what do we do about it? And I don't want to give an endless answer to this, so I'll try to be succinct. On the one hand, we have to build up our own resilience. I mentioned that. Second, we do have to respond when they do things that we think are unacceptable. And that doesn't mean we respond in kind. So I think there have been successive waves of responding to Russian intelligence activities, malign Russian intelligence activities, by collectively agreeing to expel hundreds and hundreds of Russian diplomats who were not diplomats, or not solely diplomats, but who were conducting intelligence activities. That has demonstrably, as we look at these things, diminished Russia's ability to conduct malign intelligence activities within NATO countries. And that is the kind of thing that needs to continue to diminish the threat to us. So, as I say, there are responses which actually have an effect, which aren't just attributing it a cyber attack. We do that. It's important. I am not at all convinced that Russia could care less if we attribute a cyber attack or does anything about it. I think they probably post it on the wall as a badge of honor if we identify them, and then they move on to a different name and a different kind of attack. But you come to a very important question, actually something which I think about all the time, which is how do we get on the front foot when it comes to communications? And just to put it a different way, what you see in particular in Russia is that the Kremlin has closed off the Russian information space. I used to be the NATO spokesman a few years ago. And, I watched as they took control of the media, where they took control of the internet, of course, expelled all opposing views, but also installed, like China did, but in a slightly less effective way, a sort of great firewall of control over the internet. The net result is now it is extremely difficult to communicate to the Russian population. And for me, again, I'm not saying this is a NATO position, but for me, this is a fundamentally concerning issue because Putin is preparing generations of Russians to think that we hate them, that the collective West, as they call it, wants to damage or dismantle Russia. Obviously not true. Contain Russia. True when it means we don't want them invading their neighbors. And, they're training kids in school with weapons. You've seen that. So being able to communicate to Russians, to me, is extremely important. It is extremely difficult. So we can discuss this more in another format, but I do think that we need to look at innovative ways, exactly as you say, to carry our message to the Russian people. Some of that work is going on. It used to go on decades ago, and it needs to happen so that they can hear the truth. I'm not talking about disinformation in any way. Just the truth about who we are, but also about what is going on in their own country. These are messages which our diplomats pass in Russia, and I know them, but they are very, very small voices. And then you come to the point of the rest of the world. And it is very, very important that we do communicate to them. And again, I'll give you my own view. Good messages aren't enough. We have to come with actual resources to address their challenges. So if you look at what Russia comes with in Africa, they come with, Wagner Group or whatever it's called now. China comes with billions. I mean, there's a classic expression from an African minister, who I will not name, who said the Chinese come with an airport and the Americans come with a lecture. And that's a reality. They face real restrictions. When I showed up in Central Asia, I was facing Chinese billions, Russian soldiers, in my case, happy to see the EU, but the EU had €1 billion and I had nothing. And I can tell you, I was at the back of the line to meet someone. So yes, effective messaging, but effective messaging with concrete partnership to address the real security issues that our colleagues and partners have. Final point on that, leaving aside security, I spoke with an African minister of information technology, if you want to call it that, and he had just bought Huawei for the whole country. And I said to him, why did you buy Huawei? And he said, look, I'm not an idiot. I understand the risks, but it's 30% cheaper and it works. And actually, you don't even have an alternative. I would pay more, but you don't have one. And so the end result was a lock-in to a Chinese system. All the data from that country is going back to Chinese servers in China to feed their AI models, et cetera. So I guess my point is, yes, good messaging, but good messaging backed up with concrete cooperation at a resource level that is at the level of relevance.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got to go to the debate.
Emma, do you want to follow on that before we go to Jessie?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick point from me. When you're talking about China and Russia and their growing influence in emerging nations and the money that they're putting in terms of infrastructure, water supply, roads, real and what have you. They're part of the BRICS alliance. I've heard that dismissed as a talking shop. That alliance has grown. Do you think it is just a talking shop, or should we be paying more attention to it?
I think, if I may, I would broaden your question a little bit. I think what we need to recognize is that there is a growing community of countries, big and small, some of whom, and a growing number of whom, are increasingly autocratic, who form part of another team. And I think China is clearly part of that team. You could call it Global South. Some people do. And, you know, China very strongly identifies itself with the Global South. What goes along with that? There is a certain amount of economic coordination, a certain amount of political coordination. That's a little awkward between them. You know, the India-China relationship is not an obvious one. They have great difficulties, including military difficulties. So there, I wouldn't overstress the relationship. But I think it's also worth noting that basically since the advent of effective surveillance technology, so I would say, you know, early 2020s, what you can see is the export of, in particular from China, the export of surveillance technologies, cameras, AI, facial recognition, gait recognition, and surveillance of social media platforms. That has been exported to countries across Africa, across Latin America, across Asia. And China trains the technicians in Beijing, but also in those countries, to operate these systems. And you can see at the same time, and I commend you to go to Freedom House, for example, that keeps numbers on this. Others do too, so I'm not just speculating. They're clear figures that since that period, the number of autocracies which was declining is now growing and continues to grow. The number of demonstrations, pro-democracy demonstrations in more and more countries is diminishing. The duration of those demonstrations is diminishing or being eliminated altogether. So I think the bigger issue for me is that there is a growing number of A, autocracies, B, countries which see themselves at least ambivalent to, if not in opposition to, the West. And technology is reinforcing them and this relationship. And that manifests itself also in international bodies, in the UN, in the bodies that set technical standards, like in the International Telecommunications Union, on votes for leadership positions. So we do need to have a bit of a comprehensive view, and then I conclude with this, ensure that we don't divide North America from Europe. We are a team, and we better play as a team, because there's another team, and it has a team captain.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the clarity and the specificity of the remarks you're making, which are extremely helpful to the committee. If I can just focus on a couple of points. You've painted a very deliberately, I think, realistic, concerning picture about the issues in relation to kind of democracy and the function of democracy. And I just want to pick out a couple of points there. So one level you might consider is that of consent, as it were, encouraging elements within a democracy to attempt to split it up or to divide or to overturn an economic or political structure. And then another one would be specific interference with elections, for slightly different things. And I guess the question then is, well, what tools do the team you're describing, what we might call the liberal democracies, our team, if you like, have to counter some of these hybrid threats at these two levels, at the consent level and then at the election level? And of course, we can think about, you know, intelligence and cyber interventions and the like, but you've already told us that there's strict limits on some of those. And I suppose the further question is, you know, if some of those tools are coming from the US, which is a highly technically advanced team captain, if they think of themselves in that term, I don't think we do within, you know, the UK or Europe, but if they do in this area, then the use of those defences may itself be a form of compromise. So just wonder if you could comment on some of that stuff.
A NATO civil servant and a Canadian know thin ice when they see it, and I don't want to comment too much on everyone's democracy. So a couple of things. One is I commend to you a couple of books by a guy named Peter Pomerantsev, who is, I think, the expert on Russian disinformation. And his first book was entitled "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." And the point of it was that the strategy that the Kremlin pursues, but now it's more than the Kremlin, is not necessarily to convince you that their version of truth is correct, but to confuse you into believing nothing. And increasingly, I see that. I see that with my nephew. He thinks everything's an opinion. It's someone's opinion. Truth is your truth or my truth. So I think one thing we really have to do is think hard about how to ensure that what our populations see, they can know is true or not true, and they can have confidence in truth. And there are companies, platforms thinking hard, and governments. I just spoke to a very high-level US colleague who is thinking about how you ensure that, for example, if President Biden or Prime Minister Sunak gives a speech, that people can check that what they're seeing online is actually the real speech that he gave or some sort of version of it. And there are ways to do that. They're expensive, but they can be done. Second is to really work on media literacy, so that the media understands the role that they play, the role that they need to play, but also how they can discern between truth and not truth. Third, I think you really raised an important point, that a lot of the disinformation, I'd say the majority of it based on what we see, is not to create lies, but it is to identify existing fissures in our societies and then drive wedges into them hard. And that works. So I think in the run-up to elections, as you pointed out, we really need to raise our game, raise our level of alert, but also try to diminish some of these wedges. That's extremely difficult. Another point is to educate the population. We look at our new members, Sweden and Finland, with great fondness because they bring, aside from their military capabilities, great societal resilience to hybrid, to gray zone attacks for obvious reasons, in particular in the case of Finland. But if you look at Sweden, Sweden has given a pamphlet to every single citizen to say, this is what you need to look for. And, there was a little bit of criticism like, oh, you're frightening people. Well, actually, they need to be aware. This is a different environment. So we cannot go, in my view, with the same approach that we had 15 years ago when I happily was thinking that we were, in this indefinite period of good times. Well, they're over now. So the population needs to be, yes, more concerned, but also more aware. Then if you look at the Baltic states, they have taken stronger measures when it comes to foreign ownership of media in their country. They have taken stronger measures when it comes to broadcasting of foreign media in their country. And it's a difficult discussion because, so I have a really close Bulgarian friend, and she said she grew up in the communist era, and they have a certain sympathy towards Russia in half of the Bulgarian population. And she said to me, it used to be that we couldn't watch Western TV and we didn't like it because the Russians were censoring it. But now we can't watch Russian TV because the EU blocks it. And I can't explain to my family why that's different. And I explained to her why it's different. Because we have a high level of vulnerability to Russian disinformation that's penetrating our environment, and they lie all the time, and we can't just be naive about that. And she accepts it and understands it. But I recognize also that these are difficult discussions for everybody, and every country has to set the threshold But even in my own country, we are looking at minority communities and looking at how they are being influenced by disinformation in, for example, the Chinese language that we don't necessarily always pay attention to, or the Russian language, less so in Canada. So there are, I think, what you might call best practices, or at least practices, taking place across the alliance in different areas, which could enlighten any individual member if they wished to sort of raise the level of resilience when it comes to information. But bottom line, and I speak for myself, we need to do it because we are very open and very vulnerable to what are clearly well-resourced, highly sophisticated, and increasing information campaigns against our populations.
How are strategies such as deterrence and collective defence adapted for hybrid operations compared to more conventional defence?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is the reason gray zone attacks are effective is precisely because they are harder to deter. And part of the reason they're harder to deter is because the attacker has plausible deniability, or enough plausible deniability, including because they, when identified, spray out a range of other versions of the story, so you don't know what to believe. And we saw that very much, for example, with MH17, where Russia put out 34 different versions of what had happened in the first 2 weeks. And we see this with attacks on critical undersea infrastructure. So one of the ways in which we can be more effective in deterrence is being more effective in identifying the attacker more quickly. And we need to put resources into that. That's exactly what we're doing with regard to critical undersea infrastructure. We want to deny deniability. And that can be done across the spectrum, but you have to put resources into it, and you have to be quick and confident, but also be willing to accept a 90% certainty because you might not ever have 100. So that's one way. Second way is, and those of you who have studied nuclear deterrence or military deterrence know, you basically have deterrence by denial and deterrence by response. Deterrence by denial is you build up your resilience to make it clear that an attack will be unsuccessful anyway, so there's no point in trying. Deterrence by response is by saying, if you attack me, I'm going to respond somehow, and it's going to be more painful for you than it was for me, so you might want to not do it. Deterrence by denial is something we can do at all times. So NATO has, with all allies, agreed what we call baseline requirements. So these are civilian requirements for national resilience. And I think that there are measures we can learn from allies. So in Finland, they sit down every 6 months with government and industry leaders. They exchange views on what the threat environment is, and they decide together what the country needs to be resilient. And the industry leaders go away, and as part of their budget and planning, they say, okay, I need to have this much in reserve because I'm part of society. So if you cut Finland off for 6 months from the world, they can handle it. They have the fuel, they have the medicine, they have the food, they have the grain, because they know it can happen. But it's a full society effort, and we don't just expect industry to suddenly step in at the last minute. So I really believe that having a much stronger relationship with industry, cyber industry, the food industry, the energy industry, so that they are getting regular threat briefings, so that they can tell you what they see, they feel part of the effort, then we get much stronger societal resilience across the board, and we set them clear targets and standards that they can meet, and we provide support to help them meet those standards, as we do, for example, in cyber, either positive or negative. You know, positive meaning some resourcing or some tax breaks. Negative is if you don't report on a cyber attack against critical infrastructure in the United States now, well, then you're violating a directive, and you should say, because otherwise we don't know what's happening. And then there is deterrence by response, and I mentioned one of the measures that we have already taken, which is to eject Russian intelligence officers, another step we took was to cut off Russian oil and gas, which then improved our resilience and imposed a cost on Russia. And you've seen gas profits have gone down like this. So those are sort of, I think, the three major elements that we need to consider when it comes to deterrence. Deny deniability, improve your resilience, deterrence by denial, and be more effective and prompt in response, including in the ways that I mentioned.
I'll just quickly ask you, you talked about deniability on the subsea cables, and you said we'd never be 100% certain that, say, Russian had damaged a subsea cable. When there are thousands of miles of these cables, how do you physically do what you've suggested we should do?
So, very good question. And there are a few things that you can do and that we are doing. First is to connect industry operators with our maritime command, and that we have done so that we can share information with them on an ongoing basis. We just set up a critical undersea infrastructure network with industry, and by the way, we've connected them to our critical undersea infrastructure cell in our maritime command in Northwood, so thank you for hosting it. Second, we need to enhance very fundamentally the picture. So we are building a tool which fuses information from satellite information, much of which is publicly available, to basically the transponder data that all ships at sea are supposed to be broadcasting, to drones at sea, drones undersea, to the information that the companies provide. So the cables in particular that they run, they can easily put sensors in there which give much, much more detailed information. You can fuse all of that. We are fusing all of that using an AI tool, basically like a task-oriented chatbot, which can take it all and say, you need to look here. At any given point, there are about 50,000 ships at sea in Europe every day. We know where the critical infrastructure is. Using these tools and some other tools, we can say, or industry can say to us, there's a ship that's loitering over a key node for longer than it should be. Go have a look. And this ship left a Russian port. This one you need to look at. So you can sift through all that data. And the AI can really help you narrow it down to 2 or 3 that you need to look at. And then we can deploy assets. So our Supreme Allied Commander deployed assets after Gazprom to make a point. Around the Baltic Connector, we did the same thing. So we can, I think, use existing tools and technologies, and we are, in very, very effective ways. And just to finish the story, when Baltic Connector happened, we had all intelligence people and military people doing things. And my intern said, give me 2 hours. And he went down the hall and came back and said, this ship left that port at that time. It turned off its transponder here, and then it looks like it dragged its anchor there. And he was right. This kid was like 24 years old, and I hadn't even asked him to do it. So actually, there's a lot of information out there that we can use, and I think your military and government are using them, and so are we.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, James. We understand a whole government strategy is the way to build resilience and deterrence, but here in the UK, the MOD defence is used first and last in any crisis, whether that be COVID or flooding. It becomes the risk manager of last resort. Now, accepting that defence plays a pivotal role in deterrence by punishment or response, as you put it, which actually I prefer response to punishment, how can we encourage other government departments to play their role, and what role do you think UK defence should play?
In resilience, do you
Yes.
mean, or deterrent?
Well, both, please.
I think the role in deterrence is probably pretty clear for the UK military, and we're very glad for it because they're a great military, honestly. And I come from a defense department, so I have that particular sympathy. But also, coming from a defense department, I think your question is really important because the Canadian military now is increasingly drawn into all kinds of things for which it wasn't necessarily meant to. And I'll give you one example, which is resilience against the effects of climate change. Because basically now every summer my country burns, and the military, which is supposed to be doing military things, is doing firefighting, and that's not what they are designed to do. And if they're doing it, they're not doing something else. So I think it's really, really important, exactly as you say, that a whole of government approach is required for resilience. So, as I said, we have set these baseline requirements, or we offered them to allies. Allies agreed to them, and they have gradients. We have, in NATO, in the cyber sphere, offered basically baseline requirements when it comes to the cyber protection of critical infrastructure. That obviously engages industry. Our government's all signed up to that. It again offers levels of support. We offer support to assess and then to grow. So from a NATO point of view, we are doing our best to encourage allies to have this greater whole of government approach. But I come back to what I said before. I would really suggest that a visit to Finland, and they have a Ministry for National Resilience, bringing together all the relevant elements of government and the private sector. And then that's my second point is I think what we have at NATO is in many ways, except for the big defense primes, an ad hoc relationship with industry. And what we are seeing now is in one sector after the other, from energy to cyber to the industries that are affected by climate, to startups and scale-ups, they're coming to us and saying the same thing over and over. And the big tech platforms, very much the big tech platforms. We know the world has changed. We know that we have a role to play in defending society, and we want to. What we don't know is what the threat environment is and what it might be. And we don't know what government requirements are and will be in this area, so we don't know how to plan for it. And I have the experience now that actually we're in a moment where we can really build a much more structured relationship with industry at the top level and then down to have, sustained engagement that will make a difference for the whole society. And let me give you an example which I have brought into NATO from the UK. I went to visit the UK National Cybersecurity Centre and found there industry embedded into the NCSC. So I asked them, because I was told that they were basically working there either for free or at a very low cost. And so I asked the industry representatives when I was visiting, because we're designing a cyber center here, why are you here? And they said, A, purpose. They knew they needed to be part of it. B, they got information which helped them do what they needed to do. So as embeds, not ad hoc visits. And then third, interestingly, one of the guys said that when they were competing on the open market for talent in the UK, cyber talent, and it's hard to get, when they said to young engineers, if you come to work for us 1 day a month, you'll go work in the NCSC and help defend the UK, they signed with them. So it was actually a recruiting tool. So I think you have a real opportunity with industry now, which we didn't have even 3 or 4 years ago, to build a very, very different relationship for a whole of society approach.
Can I just ask, when you said we offer, and you said NATO, we offer, is that the Joint Intelligence and Security Division? If not, what do they do, and how do they support alliance partners?
So the Joint Intelligence and Security Division, in essence, fuses intelligence from allies, and does that on a day-to-day basis. So that doesn't necessarily mean all allies have to agree on what that intelligence is, but they can offer you with input from a select group of countries. Okay, this is something you need to know based on input from this number of countries. Then they also prepare broad, agreed intelligence on which we all rely and which is on the basis of all allies providing their input and giving their agreement to it. And that's a sort of foundation for us to have a common view of what's going on in the world. They don't generate their own. NATO is not an intelligence gathering body. We don't have spies. It's a little bit too bad because when I watched the first Mission Impossible movie, apparently the bad guy stole the list of NATO undercover agents. And sadly, we don't have that. My son was really impressed that we have it, but we don't actually. So they're just fusing what you provide to us and the other allies.
Can I just ask one quick last question? Does NATO have a strategy to assess what type and scale of hybrid attack would constitute a decision to invoke Article 5?
So good question. And the short answer is no, but deliberately no. And the reason it's deliberate is twofold. One is we don't want to show where the line is so that a potential adversary will know where the line is and stay just below it. They'll move up to that line and just stay below it. Second is you don't know what it is until you see it. So to give you a concrete example, and I've been at NATO a long time, before September 11th, if we had tried to agree that a bunch of terrorists hijacking planes and flying them into a big civilian building in any one of our countries would have constituted an Article 5 situation, we wouldn't have gotten agreement on it. And worse, it would have been excluded when we needed to invoke Article 5. So we believe, allies all believe, it is better to be ambiguous and make the decision when they decide together that it has been reached for both of those reasons.
Thank you, James. Chair.
Emma.
Thank you very much. Hello again. What NATO countries are best at countering hybrid threats, and can you give us any examples from them?
Which countries are best?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it varies from country to country based on the tool. I've talked about Finland and Sweden extensively, so I won't mention them again. But if you look, for example, in particular to the Baltic states, in particular, for example, to Estonia, their cyber resilience is extremely strong. Again, if you look at the Baltic states, the steps they are taking to diminish Russian influence into their minority communities is very sophisticated. I think it's debated very democratically. So, that offers, I think, some very important lessons for all of us on how to do it. Because I think one thing is what you do, and the second is how you do it. And it needs to be transparent to the public so that when accusations come that it's not democratic, and these usually come from those, funded from outside who don't like that you're doing it, you can come back and say, no, these are the steps we followed. Everybody agreed to it. So I think that those are very important. Then another example, I could really go on for a very long time, but our German colleagues, the German government is very active in sending officials to the very local level to private companies to say, look, be careful about investment from unfriendly to the UK or less friendly to the UK actors, because, you might not have thought about it. And many of my friends don't think about it, who are in, startups. But when I tell them, oh yeah, but if you do this, if you take investment from, for example, China, these are the risks. And then they say, oh, okay, well, maybe I don't want to do that. So educating the private sector, Germany does that extremely well, at least in the particular area that I mentioned. Let me just look at my list of other areas where people are doing very well. I mean, I think cyber is probably one of the most important. And honestly, I think what the U.S. has done, and you can debate, of course, every country has to make its own decisions on how it does it. But what the U.S. has done, and to a different degree what the EU has done in engaging with critical infrastructure operators to raise the level of cyber resilience and to report on effective cyber attacks against them is extremely important. One of my real concerns is that there is a huge amount that goes unreported. When it comes to ransomware, there's a huge amount of malware that is not detected because countries are not investing enough and companies are not investing enough in basic cyber hygiene. And it's getting slightly better, but it is still the case that CEOs are not rewarded for cyber hygiene. And they should be, because it's all fine until it all goes away, and then it's really, really expensive. So I find it very interesting, your sort of best practice question, and as I reflect on what we should be doing next, maybe we should be putting together a best practice compendium. We have done that, for example, when it comes to adaptation to climate change. So my colleagues and I prepared a compendium of best practices for allies to share. And we did that also on how to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe it'd be very interesting to do something like that on hybrid as well. So I'll take that away and reflect on it.
We'll look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything further, Emma?
No, all good.
James, thank you so much. We've had our time, but you were extremely helpful. Some really, really good insight there. Very helpful for our report. And thank you very much indeed for spending the time with us.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. We're at your service.
Thank
you.
Order.
Has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.